So welcome to all of you. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. Thank you, colleague Michelle High, managing editor. Thank you, Sid Lipset, who is our editor for arts and culture. We have a fabulous hour planned for you. My job is to say hello, tell you why this is a very interesting conversation. By the way, in my own succinct fashion, you'll hear more about the proper title in a moment, but I think it's a rich conversation about musical heritage in a soundbite age. That may not be doing it justice, but you'll hear more in just a moment. Welcome. We're going to go an hour, hard stop 1 p.m. Eastern. For those who can stay a few minutes after the formal adjourning of the program, there's an epilogue and a clip. You'll hear more about that in due course. But Rupert Allman, who is a distinguished broadcaster and writer, award-winning NPR executive producer, and so much more. Rupert, welcome. You have the floor. You'll give a proper introduction to Joe and Lara and run the conversation. We're looking forward.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Happy Monday, everybody. Delighted to be here. I will get to the intros momentarily, just to let you know that Jeffrey was far too kind. I run a program on 1A on NPR called 1A, and it's usually the work of my fantastic team. I have very little say in what goes on, but they're very talented. I'm proud to be working with them. I always think sometimes introductions are really best done by some of the protagonists themselves. So I'm going to do that right now and let you know that the early part of the conversation, there'll be plenty of time for us to get into questions later on, will be sort of moderated by me, and you'll hear quite a lot from Joe and Lara. So Joe, do you want to give us a little thumbnail about who you are and what you do?
Well, I think what's pertinent is I've written a book called Dvořák's Prophecy and the Vexed Fate of Black Classical Music, and produced 6 Dvořák's Prophecy films that accompany the book. And I think that's sufficient for now.
In full disclosure, Joe and I have been working on a number of what we've been calling more than music documentaries, which have been airing sporadically on NPR. And I believe it was last year that we did something adjacent to Joe's work with Dvořák and this particular subject, which was great fun. Lara's here as well. Again, I think probably in your own words, in terms of how you'd like to describe who you are, what you do, and your interest in this topic.
This is my least favorite thing to do, introduce myself. I'm a pianist and a scholar of American music. I've been playing in the same waters as Joe for many years, working to sort of excavate below the surface of American classical music. What the tradition is, who made it, and why. I also work in media. I have a video podcast series on NPR called Amplify with Lara Downes. I have a program on KDSC in San Francisco, KUSC in LA. I write. I have a record label called Rising Sun Music, which is devoted to recordings of music by Black composers, first recordings or first fine recordings. And I move around the world and play the piano a lot.
Very well. Thank you so much. Right, let us get underway. We've got a lot to get through. And we're going to start by listening to a clip of Marian Anderson. This is her singing My Country 'Tis of Thee at the Lincoln Memorial.
Coming.
That is magnificent, magnificent. And my question to you, Joe, is, what on earth has that got to do with you, your books, and your films?
So if you time that, it's 44 seconds, and it is indeed hypnotic and magnificent. I was stunned and dismayed when I watched the recent PBS 90-minute documentary of Marian Anderson that we never got to hear her sing for 44 seconds. And when this clip was used, we heard and saw 17 seconds, after which there was a voiceover of an actress reading something said by Marian Anderson, accompanied by photographs that had nothing to do with the Lincoln Memorial Concert. So this soundbite culture, Rupert, as you know, is now endemic, although we attempt to counteract it on our 1A documentaries. And I think it defeats the efforts that people like Lara and I make to cultivate and remember the cultural past. So my 6 films, which I've produced as a companion to my book, both consciously and I would say subliminally attempt to subvert this way of cultivating and reinforcing short attention spans. I don't think the short attention span really supports the effort to reconnect with the American past and the American musical past, which is increasingly exigent. And that is the reason that we watched this clip of Marian Anderson singing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
Well, I'm pleased we did. I'm going to quote something which I've got in front of me, which is actually taken from the review you just cited, Joe. And what Mark says is this, quote, "I remediate soundbite epistemology, Snapchat concentration spans, and ahistorical narcissism that bedevil our culture today." And that Joe's films eschew the Ken Burns style of rapid montage and instead go into deep focus. It's the equivalent of documentary equivalent of slow food. And there is time to absorb, think, and remember. And just for context here, the show I look after, 1A, is a national talk show. We have 2 hours every day. And we, to a certain extent, also show the soundbite movement, in part because we have the luxury of the fact that we're not beholden to commercial sponsors, that the expectations from a public radio audience expects things to be done in depth. And so therefore, that's exactly what we do. But I think it also goes against the grain of the fact that the repackaging, which I think Joe is alluding to, is in somehow a kind of popular way to get it in front of more eyeballs and eardrums. In many respects, what we have found is that the reverse is true, and that on so many subjects, whether it's culture or whether it's health, there is a yearning for something which goes beyond 10 seconds. And I think the other piece I'll just mention at this point is the fact that obviously we've got what you might call just old-fashioned radio, people stuck in their cars in traffic listening to what's on the wireless. But of course, in the last 10, 15 years, we've had this huge boom in podcasting. And that does make money for some people. And it also shows the fact that we have producers out there who are actually taking more time to tell their stories. The great thing about podcasting is you don't have to limit it to an hour or 30 minutes. You can lay it out over the course of 8 episodes. And so when I've been working with Joe, we've been spending 50 minutes or so getting into, subjects tied to cultural memory on that regard. And I think the cultural memory piece is so fascinating. And Joe, I'll ask you to pick up again here about where your mind goes on this subject of cultural memory and the part it plays in the work that you do.
So just briefly, the review that we just heard excerpted was by Mark Grant, who we will hear from later in this show in the American Scholar. We're going to see a clip now, 2 minutes long, from the film that I made called Charles Ives America, which is an exercise in cultural memory. And in that film, people really can talk for as long as they want. And we can hear entire compositions, including one called the Housatonic at Stockbridge by Ives. We hear the entire song and then the entire orchestral version of that song. And this is the very beginning of the presentation of the orchestral version of the Housatonic at Stockbridge, maybe the most beautiful nature portrait in the American symphonic repertoire, as introduced by the conductor, James Sinclair. So here's an example of these films which attempt to curate cultural memory.
The Housatonic at Stockbridge is also an orchestral piece that followed his original ideas just after his honeymoon. He wanted to capture in more complex sound the real sound image of that event: early morning, a church choir practicing, mists, the feel and look of the river. How do you translate it into sound? He didn't have a lot of experience writing for orchestra or in hearing people play his music. He would get theater orchestras, small groups, to play particular ideas and experiments. But when it comes to a piece like this, it's an absolute triumph over inexperience to be producing such an amazing texture. The bottom sound is the depth of the river, the low strings, and then there are above that slightly more moving lines that represent the surface of the water, and above that a more magical mix of strings in multiple layers, each playing at a different speed and meandering through different kinds of pitches. It ends up being a sonic world that is unique and is admired by so many people when they hear it.
Well, I think that for me stands out as Joe in full flight in terms of his documentary work, because what Joe does with these films is he's looking to contextualize, in this case, Ives, in a cultural narrative, which is really about rooting American classical music in an American past. And that was why I was excited to work with Joe on his Dvořák's Prophecy, because it is all about that. It's the sorrow songs. It's about black classical music and its roots. And I think that's where, at this point in the conversation, it's important that we hear from Lara, because you've spent so much time, Lara, excavating Black classical music and curating America's musical past. What is it about that in particular which is so important for you?
I mean, I guess what I'm thinking as I'm listening to the beginning of this conversation is that, you know, my work poses to me a challenge and an opportunity. I think I find myself most often in the position of issuing an invitation, right? The challenge of giving a concert in which I'm going to introduce music by composers who are not known to my audience and try to tell some of their stories and open the door to the listener's curiosity, right? Without going on and on from the stage, because honestly, nobody likes that. So, you know, I've learned, I don't want to say soundbite. I don't think I do sound bites, but I have learned, I think, the art of short form storytelling that then it serves as an opening to a deeper dive. And I think I'm fortunate in that I have multiple platforms to do that. So on stage, there's one scenario, you know, playing the music and just introducing these composers and showing where they fit in the stream of American music. And then I can do that on a somewhat deeper level, I think, on recordings. And then, of course, I have the podcast, broadcast space to go deeper into the stories. I mean, my motivation for all of those things is I think that this body of work fills out what we have known about American music. It opens this art form to so many more listeners. It not only changes what we know about the history of American music, but what we know about the history of our country and our people. And frankly, just kind of makes it bigger and better.
Joe, on that point, I wonder if you want to just engage on this point about the fact that curators or broadcasters or producers still have a responsibility to do something which is attractive and accessible. And there's still the fact that a lot of audience out there need to be hooked. They need to be sold on it because we're told people's attention spans are narrowing.
Well, I got hooked on this topic long ago because I grew up in love with classical music and discovered early on that something bad had happened to classical music in the United States. It had been marginalized and it never really acquired an American cast. It remained Eurocentric. And the 11 books that I've written, if they have a common topic, it's why did that happen? And what can be done about it at this point? And certainly the most obvious remedy is in some fashion to curate the American musical past and embed it in the American past generally. When I look at that challenge, two obvious challenges within it are the challenge of excavating Black classical music and the challenge of prioritizing Mr. Ives, because Charles Ives is probably, you could say, our greatest talent, creative talent in American classical music, and he's still regarded as kind of toxic. If my film, Charles Ives America, has a single purpose, it's to argue that it's not toxic, that it's music that we can know and love. And so this clip that we just saw, the 2 minutes of the Housatonic Stockbridge with Jim Sinclair, that's it, that's what it's about, trying to present this music so that people will realize not only its significance, but its accessibility. So the challenge that we're facing, in answer to your question, Rupert, is to figure out ways, whether it's Lara Downes doing a concert or Rupert Allman doing a radio documentary, to deeply and profoundly engage an American audience in American classical music. And there are various ways to do that. I've tried to do it in books and now in films. I think we're trying to do it on our 1A documentaries. And when Lara espouses Scott Joplin, which is what she's doing right now, she really attempts to figure out his place in American history and American cultural history. And the fact that she is so informed is manifest in the way that she presents this music. I don't think it's a common achievement. There are many reasons for that, but it's an attempt, I feel, that's barely been made. And if we don't make it now, it's almost too late. I mean, this music is already rapidly receding from our cultural environment.
Lara, do you think the message that you're taking is universal, or are you trying to change it a little bit, package it a little differently, depending on the audience that you're speaking to on a particular platform or through a particular medium?
I think maybe my strongest effort is to push this into the hands of the next generation. So I'm working, all the time with conservatory students, and they have a huge appetite for this information, this music, and this shift to, what we've been calling the canon. And I think that, that's the greatest hope for really bringing all of this repertoire back into the center of our focus. So I kind of don't worry about that. I've promised Joe that I will I will be the annoying beam of sunshine here, right in your face. But no, I mean, the next generation, they're so tired of what they've been going through in school, which shockingly is essentially what I went through in school. Same old rep, same old lists, same old expectations. And they're thrilled to discover Florence Price, but not just in one area. They really want to understand more about what American music is and why, and how that connects with the rest of the world, so they don't feel like marginalized classical music weirdos over here in a corner that doesn't touch the rest of life. So that's one thing. And I also think I've learned a lot just recently in the broadcast space on a couple of levels when I started doing a show on these two stations, which are, they're beloved and highly highly listened to stations in San Francisco and LA, very huge listenership. There had been some concern about really shifting the sound of the programming and the scope of the storytelling, and the feedback from listeners has been overwhelmingly positive about that. So I think there's a lot of curiosity. I think that I don't know where to assign blame, but somehow our industry has been denying curiosity for decades. And I do think that that's starting to shift on multiple levels. So I really feel very hopeful about a new wave. Also, the other thing that connects with this, I think, is the music that's coming from young American composers now, which is, going back to this kind of split that Joe, examines, and really picking up, I think, where some composers left off in the 30s and 40s, and embracing an American sound with awareness.
Yeah, it's gonna take a minute.
Yeah. So,
The
but
hot water was mixed in with it.
Hey, Patrick, I don't know if you could hit your mute button. That would be great.
yeah.
Yeah.
Patrick, could you hit your mute button?
Okay, good.
Thank you. Laura, let me lean into the optimism then, because I think that's always a positive place to be. I was thinking, as we were preparing for this conversation, about the fact that technologically there shouldn't be any barriers left now. Publishing is so easy. Anyone can do it in anyone's room. So where are the barriers? Where are the barriers? Do you think they're just simply kind of left over institutional, people looking like me?
No, not just like you. I think here's a huge barrier. If you're a young student in conservatory now, your teacher is probably of a certain age and of a certain generation and of a certain bank of knowledge that is, I don't want to say finite, but is comfortable. So your teacher doesn't really want to help you expand your horizons. You have to do that on your own. And it has been hard. I mean, I think I know 2.5 people in the world, and they're all on this Zoom, who've been working in this area, Mark and Joe. And, I came into this, I think that my conduit to becoming a self-educated scholar in this area was Tom Hampson, just as a self-identified star performer and scholar of American music at the same time. But none of us had this handed to us. So I really think that the barrier is habit, comfort, and I think fear, a lot of fear of what you don't know. And if you're in a position of teaching, programming, managing in this industry, that fear can really get in your way of doing anything different. I think what we've seen over the last, year and a half now, where there's been this sort of frantic attempt to change the look of the programming, and we're going to play all music by Black composers all year. That's fleeting, and it wasn't done very well. And there's just a lot of missing information that needs to be had in order to do it well and to really authentically change the way that we're presenting and teaching music in this country.
I think that's fascinating. Joe, lean into this for me if you would do, because you're a little more Eeyore-ish, I think, sometimes on where we might be going. And I was really interested to what Lara was talking about, kind of fear in teaching, maybe fear in media. Is that something you pick up on? Is that something you've observed? And what do you do about it?
Well, of course, it's something I've observed. I mean, we have to talk about orchestras and the failure of American orchestras to curate the American past and cultivated American classical music. This is one of my great obsessions. And I always point to the moment when Arthur Judson in the 1930s was responding to criticism of the New York Philharmonic. Arthur Judson is the big power broker in American classical music in the first half of the 20th century. He's like our, Robert Moses, as described by Robert Caro. He ran the Philadelphia Orchestra, the New York Philharmonic, he founded Columbia Artists. And he made the fatal decision running the New York Philharmonic that it should not have a music director. And it didn't. It had a principal conductor, Arturo Toscanini, who overwhelmingly programmed music by dead European masters. And there was blowback because you had in Boston a conductor, Kusevitsky, and in Philadelphia, a conductor, Stokowski, who were visionaries. And they were doing the right thing. And the Philharmonic was doing the wrong thing. And Judson, who normally never spoke publicly, finally responded in a letter to the New York Times. And he said, we can only go as far as the public will let us. So that's the cat out of the bag, the notion that the public leads taste rather than the orchestra, the music director, the conductor. That is a fatal formulation that we have been stuck with ever since. We need a conductor like Leonard Bernstein when he conducted the premiere of Ives' Second Symphony belatedly in 1951 to lead taste. We need orchestras to lead taste. What Lara is doing, attempting to do, is to lead taste. What I'm attempting to do, and I work with a lot of orchestras, although not the big orchestras, is I'm attempting to lead taste. Somebody's got to take this initiative. More people have to take this initiative. It's not enough in a panic to program formulaically one piece every time we give a concert by a Black composer. That's not going to work unless it opens a door to a new purview, what I call the new, whatever the hell I call it, new paradigm for American music that's bigger, more inclusive, more expansive, more diverse than the tiny paradigm, the standard narrative that we've been living with for ever since World War I. So yeah, we need orchestras to take an initiative and to attempt to lead taste.
Laura, I wonder whether, I'm thinking more short term here, to your point around fear in education, that one of the drivers might be the fact that, particularly when it comes to race, these are difficult subjects, and people not necessarily don't feel qualified about going there, but they're just really, really scared about getting it wrong. And because they're scared about getting it wrong, you just avoid it and you play to an area where you can make less mistakes.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, I have students literally say to me, how can I, as a, fill in the blank, approach this music respectfully? And my answer is, learn the notes, play them well. There are situations. There are some situations around language that we need to figure out. I've just been working with the Margaret Vaughan's Credo she wrote in the mid-60s, set to the Du Bois text. And, fascinating story about why that piece never got published back in the 60s with the original text, and why it has sat dormant since 1972. And, how do choruses around the country and the world pick it up and start to perform it? This is sort of a bigger conversation that I think mostly centers on language. But I think the question of how do we approach this carefully, I mean, from my perspective, the mistake that's being made is that I feel that already within this short space of time that the music is getting programmed, it's getting segregated. And what we need is for, everyone to be playing the Florence Price concertos, and everyone to be, all of the orchestras to be playing the Dawson, and not always be relegating this music to a specific category. And it's hard to do. I think it's really kind of hard to do at any place in the pipeline except the very beginning, which goes back to Joe's point about leadership and Bernstein and what he was doing, because he wasn't just doing it for a subscription audience at the Phil. He was doing it for young people around the country, and he was doing it on TV. And that's the kind of education where we need to focus, is really broad and mainstream, and not only to the people who are already buying the tickets in the concert hall.
Well, I'm pleased you mentioned Dawson. I'm also pleased to see in the chat column questions. So feel free to get typing, because we will get to questions soon. But because we mentioned Dawson, this is an opportunity for us to sample maybe just like another minute of work that Joe has been doing. This is from the Negro Folk Symphony, The Souls of Black Folk and the Vexed Fate of Black Classical Music, one of Joe's recent films.
So what was all the excitement about? And what about that second movement that ignited such an ovation that the orchestra had to stand? It's called Hope in the Night, and it begins with a sad English horn tune, not cradled by strings like Dvorak's English horn in his Largo, but rather set atop a parched pizzicato accompaniment. A melody, Dawson writes in a program note, that describes the characteristics, hopes, and longings of a folk held in darkness. A weary journey to the light ensues.
I mean, again, I think that's, again, emblematic of what you get from Joe's documentaries, whether you're watching them on YouTube or whether you're listening to some of them sampled on NPR. Joe, on this point, let's go back to this piece about the idea that you need time to tell certain stories. Contextualize that for us, for example, when laying out the points you wanted to raise with Dawson.
Well, first, let me say that the visual content of these films was created by Peter Bogdanoff, who's probably on this chat, and that you can purchase the films via Naxos. They're released on Naxos. I will be contextualizing the Dawson Symphony this July at the Brevard Music Festival, which is doing a festival around Dvorak's Prophecy. So my task is, here we have an orchestra performing the Negro Folk Symphony by William Dawson. What do people need to know, and how should that information be presented? And there are many possible answers to this question. I'd like to begin by just saying that this is certainly one of the most formidable symphonies ever composed by an American. I was talking the other day to the conductor, Christopher Wilkins, who's conducted this symphony, and he said, to his ears, this is the best symphony composed by an American in the interwar period. It was premiered in 1934 with great success. The orchestra, the Philadelphia Orchestra, had to stand midway through the symphony after that slow movement. So there are so many questions here that need to be answered. Why was this electrifying success just an ephemeral success? How did Dawson come to write this symphony? Why did he never write any more symphonies? These questions are so loud. It seems to me you simply have to address them if you're going to perform this symphony, because it raises these questions so provocatively. So to me, the obvious thing is to create a historical narrative that begins with the sorrow songs and their endorsement by Du Bois and their endorsement by Dvorak. And the story here seems to me is extremely tangible. It goes from Dvorak to Samuel Coleridge Taylor to Harry Burleigh, and then underground to Florence Price, William Grant Still, William Dawson, and Nathaniel Dett. And this story can be told with readings and with musical compositions. And that will be the first half of this scripted multimedia program in Brevard. It will include the participation of George Shirley, now 87 years old, the first Black tenor to sing leading roles at the Met, who will both sing and do a fabulous reading from Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk. So this is kind of elaborate, but if you were to ask me the question you just asked me, which is, okay, you're presenting the William Dawson Symphony, what do you do? I would do all of that. That's what I think is worth doing.
Lara, on the this piece of cultural memory, I wonder if given that you seem to be obviously kind of fishing in so many ponds, and maybe that's just the way to go in terms of, making sure that you're kind of being creative in as many spaces as possible. But would you also just talk a little bit about kind of this idea of trust? You know, the idea of who do you go to? Where are those trusted sources for this kind of conversation? Because, you know, coming back to my bailiwick, which is about kind of media and the news, you know, trust is all over the place at the moment. And I wonder if that's also a factor in the telling of the story.
So I'm not sure I understand your question completely, but I think it sort of depends on the story you want to tell. Let me just say, so Joe, to what you just said, I mean, the history is critical, and it's an essential part of hearing and knowing this music. I guess the place where I am is really wanting to move away from the same story all the time, because that story in my mind is a little obvious. I mean, we live, all of us, in this world, and we see that racism and inequity is just an ongoing thread. We can't avoid it, and we know enough to know that it's always been there. So I'm trying so hard to shift the narrative away from, you know, the tragic and unfair and unjust aspects of these stories to the triumphant aspect of these stories. And I don't know, as far as the trust, you know, and where does the trust lie now? I'm not even sure. I think I've just kind of built a community of people who are working really hard. But I think in terms of shaping a next community and a next listenership that cares about this music, what I want to do is to really focus on a new story of lineage and legacy, that there are connections, you know, there are all these connections to be found among these composers and among these pieces of music, and that the story of he was the first and she was the only is not a true story, and it's not a productive story. And to just fill in all the gaps of what we don't know, so that I don't know what to hope for 10 years from now, 20 years from now. You know, what we expect is different, and that there's, as fear decreases, as discomfort decreases, then I think there is trust, and there is just a healthiness to approaching this music and embracing this music.
Okay, we'll get into questions in just a quick moment. So this is my last scattershot. Joe, you'll hate this because it's really like almost soundbite, okay? But I'm going to go for it. With regards to the next 5-10 years that Lara was talking about, is your cup half full or half empty?
You know, I have a double persona. On the one hand, I kind of feel discouraged and fatalistic, but on the other hand, I really keep trying. And many of my efforts go into working with orchestras. I mentioned the Brevard Festival coming up this July. I'm curating the past, and I have to believe in it if I'm going to do it. So I have 2 cups. One is half full and one is half empty.
That's just such a terrible hedge. I'm not going to accept that, but either way, I know it's the best I'm going to get. Lara, half full or half empty?
You don't need to ask me that question. You don't even need to ask me. And can I just tell you my favorite story of the things that have happened to me in the last few months? And I'll try to keep it really short. But I played the Florence Prize Piano Concerto with the Detroit Symphony a few months ago. And for one thing, the Detroit Symphony is great. They've had a lot of turnover during the pandemic. It's young players who are happy and excited and inspired to, you know, create a new orchestra. So Joe, that's good news right there. It was the Classical Roots weekend, which is not something that has sprung up in the last 2 years. It goes back to the 70s, and Detroit has been doing this for, you know, half a century. A weekend that focuses on music by Black classical composers. It was set up in in memoriam for an important civil rights leader who lived in Detroit. So that's another good thing. And we had this classical main stage concert, and then Wynton came in and did his swing symphony, and there was a work by a 25-year-old composer named Quinn Mason, and those are all really good things. And then the other good thing was that they did their first school concerts back since the pandemic. So here I am on stage, and they bring in all these kids who are in orchestra hall for the first time in their lives. And I'm walking them through, we broke the concerto down into its 3 sections, movements, and I was, giving them some context for each movement and telling them what to listen for. And all of a sudden I realized that these kids were defying my expectation of, the traditional thing where the kids don't really want to be there. Their teachers are telling them they have to be quiet and you have to go overboard to draw them in. No, we were having this great, actually a conversation. They were actually responding back to me. And it was really fun. And then I went back to my dressing room and all of a sudden this thing just hit me. And I sat down on the sofa and I realized what had just happened, which was that all of these little black and brown kids from Detroit public schools had walked into essentially a sacred space in America, in the history of American music, into this beautiful Art Deco concert hall. And the first piece of music that they ever heard there was not Peter and the Wolf. It was music by a Black female composer, played by me, telling them the story. And the last words that I left them with before we played the third movement, which is a Juba dance, is I said, so imagine 100 years ago, and Florence Price is coming to this concert hall and probably lots of people are saying, you don't belong here. And she's saying, I do belong here. And by the way, here's this Juba dance. I'm bringing my ancestors with me because they belong here too. And so to say to these kids, and you belong here. This is I don't know, when you talk about the glass half full, I think the glass half full, yeah, it's over there and it's nothing we can do anything about. It's in the past. So the glass that's half empty, just fill it up. It can be done. I promise, Joe.
Let me just mention the full glass as long as we're on this topic. I know that the current New Yorker has an article by Alex Ross on the South Dakota Symphony, which I haven't read yet, but I know the South Dakota Symphony, and that's a full glass. It's an orchestra, well, I can't even begin to describe what David Geyer has done there, but one thing he's done is he's connected to over 6 Indian reservations in the state of South Dakota. And the most motivated and engaged professional orchestral musicians that I've encountered in the United States are the members of the South Dakota Symphony, which is an orchestra that shows that it can be done.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Lara. We did promise to get to questions, and I know that there are some esteemed colleagues on the call today. So if you'd like to raise your virtual hand, I think we've all been doing Zoom long enough that we know how to do that. Feel free to do that, or just put a question in the chat. We'll try and get to those in the times that we have remaining. It's good to see Peter Bogdanoff on the call. I'll call him out because he does fantastic work for NPR, and also to Mark Grant, who got this conversation sort of started, if you know what I mean, as well as to the other Mark, who's written a fantastic book about the Star Spangled Banner. All of those things may come over the next 15 minutes. Lisa, let's. I think you are first to the game. So, what's your question?
I'm having video problems, so no screen. Sorry about that. I just wanted to say that I had the pleasure of surprisingly falling into listening to the 1A program around the holidays about the Dawson piece. And I remember, I believe Jen White was the one on 1A who introduced it. And I was like, well, geez, that sounds interesting. And like many people, I have a very frenetic life and I live the soundbite life as well. But that program trapped me. Entranced is a better word, but I couldn't stop listening to it. And when they repeated it later in the season, I found myself listening to the whole thing again, which is really saying something in today's soundbite world. And then when I looked up that program as I'm listening to the talk now, I realized, oh, this is the same Mr. Horowitz that did the Copeland program, which also had me absolutely entranced to the end. I was really caught up in those programs and only listening as a radio program. So what my sort of question at the end, and just to say that in the soundbite world and living that frenetic life, how caught up I was in those programs. What are the links? Maybe could we see the links to the film segment of this, because I didn't realize there were films. So thank you if we could find out how to see the films.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much for everything you just said. The films are purchasable. They're released by Naxos. You just go on Amazon and type in Dvorak's Prophecy films, and you can buy them on DVD. I wanted to say, Rupert, let's pitch our next two shows. Memorial Day, we're doing a show on Bernard Herrmann and his radio play, Whitman, which is a show largely about the role of radio when it was the only medium that reached many, many millions of Americans. And then on July 4th, we're doing a show based on Mark Clegg's new book on the history of the Star-Spangled Banner. And Mark Clegg, I know, is in the room. And these shows are also archived by Rupert. You can find them by just typing in, what's the best thing to type in, Rupert? 1A and then,
Yeah, I mean, if it's the Dawson, you just put in the word Dawson or Dvořák, or in that case of when we get into the Star-Spangled Banner, just like a Google search, and you'll find the program. It'll also probably appear in a podcast feed as well. But we're looking forward to making those programs. Lisa, thank you very much indeed for your comment. I promise folks that Lisa and I are not related, but it was very nice to hear from you. Tejas Srinivasan.
Yeah, you mentioned curating taste and how orchestras have to do that. I guess with someone like Ives or even, I don't know, Cage, Milton Babbitt, when the music is so esoteric and difficult to get into, how do you curate a taste so that audiences can come in and enjoy something like Ives 4 or something like that?
So the Ives Sesquicentenary in 2024, I think, is a make or break moment for American orchestras. If they don't finally come to Ives in 2024, they're just going to fall off the map. And I'm working on at least 5 different Ives festivals with 5 different orchestras. And what these festivals do is contextualize Ives. So in the case of 3 places in New England, the third of which is the Housatonic at Stockbridge, we're trying to, well, let me just say that the first of those pieces, which is Ives' response to the St. Gaudens sculpture of Colonel Shaw's Black Regiment in Boston Commons, that's a hard piece, but it's an important piece. If you play that piece, which is like a dream of, snippets of Civil War songs and American popular songs for an audience without any context, which is done all the time insofar as it's played at all, it's useless. You've got to take the trouble to contextualize it and understand Ives in relation to the Civil War, Ives in relation to race, and Ives in relation to this famous sculpture. And that is done in the film, which you saw an excerpt from, but it can also be done in live performance. So my short answer to your question is, it requires some work, but it's doable. It requires an initiative, which orchestras so far are not accustomed to taking. I've worked with orchestras all my life. I've run a couple of orchestras. I know it can be done, but it requires something other than business as usual if you're going to advocate for Charles Ives. So let's cross our fingers and look at the full cup rather than the empty cup, and imagine that in 2024, all of our orchestras are going to take seriously the challenge of finally presenting Charles Ives to a mass audience so that they understand that this is a man as important to Americans as Walt Whitman or Herman Melville or Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he's not there yet, and he should be, and he can be. And I thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, across the board, I think it requires good storytelling, which
Yes, storytelling.
Good storytelling, right? And again, I can't think of any other art form where people are completely landlocked in the 19th century. All you have to do is, give the context, give it well, make it. I don't think that accessible and relatable are bad words. I mean, just show the connections to who we are now and why. And I mean, everything that Joe just said about Ives, I don't think ever gets clearly said about Ives. It doesn't take that long. You just said it really quickly.
And it's easy. I mean, Ives is he's perfect. He's the guy who connects classical music in America to the rest of the American cultural pantheon. We have the guy we need. We've just never managed to use him.
At this point, let me bring in the author of this fantastic book. Look, I've got a copy, and the author is here on this Zoom call. Mark, thanks for writing this. What's your question?
Oh, thanks, Rupert. I really appreciate you mentioning the book, and I'm really excited about the show. And I guess it's more of an observation, but I think what's so important about what A is doing and Joe and Lara is they're reconnecting the sound to the history. I mean, part of the challenge, I think, at least within the School of Music environment, is the sort of the notion of the canon, right? There's this body of works, and those are the only works that matter. And what things like the Dawson Symphony or, Laura's work, Bringing Back Price, I mean, there's incredible music out there that we don't get to listen to ever, that we don't have in the concert hall. And I think, part of the reason is because we've allowed ourselves to be seduced by a notion that music is just supposed to be pretty or entertaining, or that it's not grappling with real ideas in complex and interesting and fascinating ways that make us better people by struggling with it. And that's what I try to get at in the Anthem book, is that this song is something that's a kind of witness to history, and it's something that people have struggled over, and that struggle tells us about ourselves, and it tells us about America. And so if we were to value the way in which music speaks to our life in a richer, more impassioned way, this kind of music like Ives and Dawson and Price, this would be the stuff we'd insist on hearing.
Right, well said.
Great. I love Beethoven too, and I love to hear it. But to me, Beethoven is not important just because it's 200 years old and we're still listening to it. It's important because of the way it speaks to a time. But we really need to emotionally graph it and hear about our own time and place. And I think that's what American music and this repertory does.
And Mark, by the way, has told the story, what Lara was just referring to, beautifully in contextualizing the Star-Spangled Banner in his new book, which again is our July 4 1A, what do we call them? Worth Music 50-minute radio documentary coming up soon. I can't wait.
And without wishing to get political, but I am, because what Mark's talking about here is almost us having a new relationship with America's past, which I think is very relevant in the minute, depending on where you are in the country and what is being taught about America's past. And the fact is that we all know history isn't just about flags and battles. It is about the fact, Lara, this idea of kind of history being uncomfortable, is that something which, again, you can see us being more mature about in the years to come?
Don't you think we are being forced to? I mean, how can we not? How can we not? But I think that a nuanced, complex truth in the end is easier to live with than something that is obviously false and partial and slanted.
Yep.
And
Nicole.
so often the music is actually such a powerful gateway. It truly is. I mean, this music allows us to have conversations that are really, really hard to have otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Marsha's written in the chat, history is uncomfortable because the truth is uncomfortable. There's the cliche, history was written by the victors. I think increasingly we're seeing history being written by those who are bearing witness, because it all happens with a smartphone in our pocket. Nicole, your question.
Hi, thank you so much for this brilliant conversation. I've had to step in and out, so apologies if this was already covered, but 2 quick questions, and if there's no time, just answer the first one. How do we think of Gershwin? Gershwin, there's, I think, fairly well established that William Grant still at least obliquely claims that some of Gershwin's most important music was pulled from his work. And so I'm just wondering of how we think of some of these pivotal creators and their relationship with Black artists. The other question I have is, where do American marching bands fit in our cultural memory? They're considered a lower art form perhaps, but it's something that's very uniquely American. And I'm wondering how the classical music scholars feel about this form.
All right, I'm going to ask Joe and both Lara to be very quick because I want to get in Mark Grant before we wrap. Joe?
I'll just say one thing, which is not a comprehensive answer to these 2 questions, which is that in my new paradigm for the history of American classical music, the two big figures are Gershwin and Ives. And they're both left out of the old standard narrative, which was a modernist narrative, which viewed both Ives and Gershwin with suspicion as kind of talented dilettantes. What I emphasize in my narrative is an intimate relationship with the vernacular. And I think that is something that Ives had, and I think it's something that Gershwin had. And I'm not into bashing Gershwin. I think he was, a genius who's still not sufficiently recognized. And I feel the same way about Porgy and Bess.
Lara, room for marching bands?
No, thank you. Someone else. No, can I would say we've been quick about Porgy, because I adore Gershwin, and I think, again, to view something in the context of its time. And I think the Gershwins had every beautiful intention in creating that piece of work. And when I saw the newest production of Porgy this fall at the Met, I really appreciated the choreography that's been done by Camille A. Brown, which actually introduces that piece of discomfort, because this is a Black story that's being told through a white lens, and there's some discomfort around that. And so leave the piece alone, leave the opera alone, and introducing this kind of very highly, what's the word? Well, it's really specific choreography that absolutely illuminates all of the questions you might have about cultural appropriation and racial stereotypes and everything, and yet weaves it into the celebration of this piece of music. And it's brilliant. And maybe it's more of that we need, is just to embrace what's weird here, what's off here, what's ugly here, and it's all part of the whole.
We should hear from Mark Grant.
Yeah, Nicole, thanks for your question. Mark, final word to you.
I think there's a danger in overlooking neglected Black composers. Florence Price and Dawson are getting 95% of the attention, and there's a whole universe of Black composers that are struggling to get performed or are part of the hidden canon of the 20th century. I mentioned some of them in my article. Ulysses Kay was a marvelous composer. We know about still, there's Julia Perry, who was a woman, African-American composer like Florence Price. There's George Walker, who was with us until very recently. And there are quite a number of others. Some of them did not work in the folk song Dvorak influence style, but nevertheless, many of these composers are eclectic and were polystylistic. They did this, they did that, and they are in danger of being neglected because of a stereotyped adherence to the need to promote one or two composers to break way into the repertoire. And there's some resentment even against Florence Price in some quarters, because it's felt that she has been given almost too many performances at the expense of other Black composers.
Well, there's a challenge for all of us in terms of making sure that we don't overlook that.
So Mark, I put there's a Spotify playlist in here that I put in a little while ago for the Rising Sun series. We've been releasing recordings every month, and there's a pile this deep. There's so much to do, and I agree on the Florence Price front. I think it was just sort of obvious and easy to grab onto that, in terms of programming, but the work is underway, and not only in excavating and shining light on what's already there, but also on the commissioning front. So thank you for saying that.
Mark, we appreciate your comments. Thank you very much indeed. We're at time, folks. It's 1:01, I'm afraid. Jeffrey, thank you so much for organizing this. We appreciate that.
Well, Rupert, thank you, and Laura and Joe. What an exciting conversation. I've taken bunches of notes. I love this. Thank you all. And Joe, if I have it right, for those who are able to stay on for a few minutes, you have something else. Is that correct?
This is the last 6 minutes of one of my 6 films, the one that's called The Souls of Black Folk. And I'm rather fond of it. And in some ways, it might furnish a felicitous epilogue to this interesting conversation. So if you want something a little more than a soundbite from one of the films, you can hang on for 6 minutes and catch the end of one of the 6 films.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thanks
you,
to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll share the screen and play that 6 minutes. The entire event will end after that 6 minutes, as I will need to reclaim my computer.
Thanks,
but
everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Lara, Rupert, and Joe, thank you so much.
For about a dozen years, it's been my privilege to perform the spirituals of Harry Burleigh in concert with the bass baritone Kevin Day. We've performed Burleigh for 36 people at the Newark School of the Arts and for 1,000 people in the great nave of the Washington National Cathedral. We've performed Burleigh in elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, colleges, conservatories, concert halls. One of the songs we most perform is "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child," which ends with the words, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child a long ways from home." Burleigh sets this song for low voice in the key of D minor, but he ends in the piano in D major. And why does he do that? You'll find out if you read the page of instructions that he writes for singers of his spirituals. Burleigh says, "Through all these songs, there breathes a hope, a faith in the ultimate justice and brotherhood of man. The cadences of sorrow invariably turn to joy, and the message is ever manifest that eventually deliverance from all that hinders and oppresses the soul will come, and man, every man, will be free." Burleigh wrote that in 1917, somewhat paraphrasing what Du Bois had earlier written. But Du Bois ends with a question. Is such a hope justified? Do the sorrow songs sing true? When Kevin Days and I first performed "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child," we ended in D major as written in the score. Ever since, we've ended the song in D minor. Somehow it feels more truthful, at least for now.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost